In the unrelenting battle against doggerel and sloth, I Kleinberg wields recycle bin magazines, X-Acto knife, and glue. More than 500 of her visual poems, which explore the accidental syntax of unintentional phrases, have been published in print and online journals worldwide. An artist, poet, and freelance writer, she lives in Bellingham, Washington, and on Instagram, she lives at I Kleinberg. This is how Peter Miller Books describes their exhibit going through the end of May at their store in Seattle's Pioneer Square neighborhood. I Kleinberg, longtime Poetry Postcard Fest participant, grew up in Los Angeles, studied textile design at Cal Berkeley. She's lived in Bellingham since 2005, has been writing since elementary school, and has had 3 careers: artist, marketing professional, and freelance writer. Since 2010, she's published 2 almost daily WordPress blogs, The Poetry Department, which is about poetry in the Cascadia bioregion, and her personal site, Chocolate is a Verb. With Luther Allen, she co-produces the Speak Easy Poetry Reading Series. She co-edited the anthology Noisy Water, Poetry from Whatcom County, Washington. A Poetry Postcard Fest participant since 2011, she was also co-editor of our poetry postcard anthology, 56 Days of August. Her solo exhibit of visual poems is on view through the end of May 2022 at Peter Miller Books in Pioneer Square. She's our guest today to talk about her practice of creating what she calls found poems and to lead us through her workshop.
Hi, I'm Judy Kleinberg, and this is my workroom, the place that I make my found poems. I spend a lot of time in here almost every day going through magazines, looking for phrases that are created accidentally. I take them completely out of context, and like any poem, this isn't a straight ahead, streamlined activity. It takes a lot of words and a lot of trying to make a poem. And so what I do is I collect them in these little drawers on a wide variety of topics. For example, here is a little drawer with cloud words, and below that a little drawer with moon words, lots and lots of different topics that seem to recur. And when I find a couple of phrases that seem to resonate with one another, I stick them onto these little strips, which are the sticky part of a Post-it note, and then I wait for the culminating fragment to show up. When that happens, I stick them onto green paper, I scan them, and repeat something like 2,500 times so far.
Judy, welcome.
Thank you, Paul. Nice.
That's an amazing video. I mean, I remember having that experience. And then when we decided it was a good idea for me to interview you, I'm like, why didn't I record that? But even better, your tour of that, which is just fascinating. And your studio is stunningly well organized. Of course, you know, that's going straight to the heart of a Virgo's, comfort zone. But tell us about how you created this process and also your studio, which we just saw.
Well, one of the things that people have accused me of my whole life is being organized. So I guess my studio is living proof. I started originally doing these found poems because I was doing collage. It grew out of the process of looking through magazines for images for collage, which I have done for as long as I can remember. And I started noticing these places where words stacked up on top of each other unintentionally because of the way the page was laid out. It might be part of a subtitle, a title, a caption, the actual text of the page. And there was some completely new syntax created out of the text on the page. And so I started capturing those. And I liked them. And I loved the accident of that process. And so then, but the thing is that you can't just find one and then find the next one and find the next one and have a poem. What I discovered very quickly was that I had to collect a whole lot of them in order to create a poem. And so I had to figure out a way to collect a whole lot of them. And first they were just all spread out on the table. And then gradually that system of drawers built. I started with one box, and now I think, I have however many. I have the mountain of boxes of little drawers.
4,000 boxes. Is it 4,000? No,
At least.
is it at least?
I have many, many thousands of words, that's for sure.
Yeah. No heavy breathing. Though.
That's right.
Well, how that sign in there caught my attention. Is this a PG moment, or what's the no heavy breathing prohibition about?
No, it's just that on the table, there are hundreds of little words that are lying there loose. And all it takes is a little fan of the hand or a little, huffing and puffing or whatever. And suddenly disorganization reigns.
Can't have that. Who was there a blowhard in your studio and you had to put up that
there's
sign?
Constantly blowhard. There's a gentleman who comes in and threatens frequently.
If Luther weren't bigger than me, I tell you, I'd rough him up for you. But that's just the way it. That's just the way it. And plus, he's a hunter, so you don't want to mess with people like that. Can you read a poem or two? I think that'd be a good place to start for people who don't know your work and are wondering what the hell we're talking about.
Yes, I will share screen here and see if we can figure this out. It's not ideal screen sharing since you're seeing a little more of the page, but this is the poem that gave my exhibit at Peter Miller Books its name, which is Orchestrated Light. The house was like jazz, low and exciting. The listening rooms, obdurately musical, curiously contrapuntal, orchestrated light. The language will come to me, a window into my darkness, the word a brick. To be the moon, you must wander the convent of the evening, full and irresistible, guilty of light. Lines coalesce, catching the moon. The house is still a book of poems, the night an expanding architecture. And this is a view of the gallery at Peter Miller Books. And in case you don't know, Peter Miller Books is quite an amazing architecture and design bookstore and has this enormous adjacent space. And so most of the work that's on exhibit has some relation to the built environment, whether it's architecture or elements such as doors and walls and windows, or materials such as stone and light and so on.
Fantastic. And we would turn left by that door. No, let's go back to that first poem, because in the construction of it, there's something interesting, I think, that leads to your process. So if you could go back to that first one there. We click on number one and we see it looks like this all came from one periodical. This first, let's call it a stanza. The house was like jazz, low end, exciting. So that all came from one newspaper or magazine article, did it not?
Yes, those I call those fragments, and they are roughly the equivalent of a poetic line. And really they're to be read like a poetic line. And that piece comes from a single magazine page. And what you're seeing there is the gutter that is between columns. That's what that long white stripe is. So I'm reading both down and across. And so the words like jazz had nothing to do with the house was. It was in reference to something else entirely in the article. And the words low and did not follow the words like jazz in the article, and the words exciting. The word exciting had something to do with something else in the article. Then in these poems, the fragments in this piece, there are 5 fragments, come from entirely different magazines. That's just the way it happens. Very occasionally, I'll find a couple, two fragments from one magazine will end up in the same poem, but that's very, very rare. And it's really important to me that there is nothing quotable in these poems. No attributable language. I'm taking it totally out of context. And also, I don't use other people's poetry. It's just when we write, whatever we do, whatever our creative mode is, we set our own rules. And so those are just a couple of my rules.
How is your house like jazz?
Well, I guess in a sense, this is like my house, which I think of as low and exciting. I live in a 1950, mid-century modern home, which is a single level. It's low. It's got sweeping openness and sort of some unpredictable turns and combinations of elements, which is what I think of when I think of jazz. This wasn't necessarily meant to be a self-portrait of my house, but I love the idea that a house could be like jazz.
Yeah, when it does get exciting, there's where the heavy breathing comes in, I imagine. I'm going to stop the sharing here so we can see you again. How did the Peter Miller exhibit come to happen?
Well, I actually have a very long relationship with Peter Miller. Long before I lived in Bellingham, I moved to Seattle, and in the mid 70s, I had a little house on 50th Street, and Peter Miller had a bookstore called Montana Books on 45th. And so he was my neighbor, and I would walk over there, and the grocery store was right at the corner. And so I'd go to the grocery store and I'd pop in and look at books and say hi to Peter. So we were friends for a very long time, and time goes by. I left Seattle for a while, thought I was going to live somewhere else. I tried Santa Fe, that didn't take. But I came back to go to a friend's wedding and stopped in to see Peter. And by that time, he had moved to a new store in Pioneer Square called Miller and Mungo. And he said, "Want a job?" I was like, "What?" Well, I ended up going to work for Peter. So I worked there from 78 to 81. And he opened a bookstore at the aquarium during that time. And then we moved up to the market, to the first of his stores on First Avenue, which was the American Institute of Architects was upstairs from that. And I was there working with him. And by that time, he had begun to specialize in architecture books. And so he moved to another location on First Avenue. He moved to Second Avenue. And then most recently, he moved to this new space in Pioneer Square, which is really wonderful. And when I went to visit visit him in the store, I saw the adjacent space, and then the wheels started spinning, because I do have so many found poems that relate to the built environment. And I proposed it, and he said yes, and we were scheduled to open in May of 2020. And that was one of the last things that shut down. So this is really quite a celebration to have these 2 years later, to have it open in May of 2022.
Yeah, it's really beautiful the way it's laid out in the bookstore. I almost called it a gallery, which it sort of is. But also getting into the bookstore, Pioneer Square is undergoing some renovation. The opening night had a very important Sounders game. So there were 68,000 people walking around the neighborhood and making it hard to get a bite to eat in a good way. But then you have to go through Post Alley. So it's counterintuitive. And then when you get in, it's like, holy cow, I've just gone through an alley and then into this beautiful, elegant space. It's really quite remarkable. Yeah. And so your work fits in right with that because of the surprise nature of these found poems. You call them found poems.
I do, or
yeah.
visual poems.
So found poems to me suggests something you find on a bathroom wall or something, and you repurpose it and say, this is a poem. And it doesn't have to be Here I Sit Brokenhearted. I'm not talking about those kind of bathroom poems. But you call them found poems because of the language being found. Is that accurate?
Right. I find these words in magazines and I repurpose them. They're also called visual poems. But you know, poetry comes with a lot of terminology, and people, when you say visual poems, people tend to go in the direction of graphic narrative or asemic poetry, which is poetry that looks like it could be handwriting, but actually has no readable sense, but is often stunningly beautiful, or some combination of image and language, and there's also erasure poetry, which is probably the most familiar form of found poetry.
Yeah. And only one chapbook so far of these poems.
Yes, I have a small chapbook called Love Period that is available at the bookstore currently. And it's a collection of love, found love.
2,500 found poems and counting. What makes you do something like this for so long? 2,500 poems like this.
You know, it keeps amusing me. It keeps my interest going. And I figure at some point, maybe that will stop. I'll lose interest in it. It won't be engaging. But I'm continually surprised when I find these words, when I'm able to connect the words into a small poem. And so I keep doing it. And I'm looking in other possible directions. I've seen the possibility of taking it other ways. I've tried to make long poems out of these. It doesn't really work very well. They look kind of contrived. And so that hasn't really worked well, but I'm considering other possibilities. And meanwhile, I just keep looking for words.
How does this practice assist or mesh with your Poetry Postcard Fest practice?
Well, they really are sort of parallel. I don't do the found poems as my poetry postcards because they're actually glued. Let me pull one out here if I can. I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but they're small and they could be postcard size. So this is the size. It's a quarter of a sheet. And the little pieces are actually glued onto the paper. So it would not withstand going through the mail. And I now have an actual postcard of the Orchestrated Light poem, also available at the bookstore, which I will probably use for this year's Poetry Postcard Fest. But the fest has really affected me in a kind of a different way, and that is the idea of sitting down and writing a short poem every day was so appealing to me that it began a practice for me and separate. So it's really a parallel practice with my found poems. I work on the found poems almost every single day, and I sit down before I do just about anything except drink coffee, and I write a short poem. And it's just something that the Poetry Postcard Fest showed me I could do. And sometimes they turn into real poems, into longer poems. Sometimes they get connected with each other. And it's been really wonderful. And needless to say, since 2011, there are quite a few thousand poems that I've written, short poems, as a result of this practice.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. thanks to Lana Ayers, who helped found it, and Brenda McBreen,
Yes.
who helped kept it going for a couple of years when I wasn't administering it. And in a whole, it takes a village. As Gregory Hishak once said, it takes a village to burn a witch. No, wait a minute. That's not the quote. Takes a village to run a postcard fest. They're beautiful poems. The gallery exhibit is fantastic. Should we send people to I Kleinberg at Instagram, or chocolateisaverb.wordpress.com, or where else?
Those are the places where you'll see my work. If you want information about Peter Miller Books, it's petermillerbooks.com, but there is no gallery page on the site. So if you want information about the show, you can certainly call or email Peter at the gallery, and all that information is on the website.
Yeah, it takes a few clicks to find out the information, but you can find the gallery and you can find their website. And thanks for your inspired participation in the Postcard Fest. You're one of my very favorite postcarders, and thank you for your time today. And to get this intimate look at your process is really an honor. And so I'm grateful that you gave it to us, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Paul. Nice talking with you.